Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. I've always loved camping. The serenity of being far from the city, the clean air, the stars, and the quiet. So when I found a remote spot deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road, I couldn't resist. My buddy Matt bailed at the last minute, so I ended up going alone. Honestly, I didn't mind. A solo trip felt like the perfect way to clear my head. I arrived late afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the tree line. The campsite was perfect. Nestled between towering pines with a small clearing for my tent and a creek nearby for water. I set up quickly, proud of how at ease I was out here. It was peaceful, the only sounds being the rustling leaves and the occasional bird call. But as twilight settled, that peace began to shift. It started with small things. The woods felt different as the light faded. The chirping of crickets seemed muted, the breeze a little too still. I brushed it off as pre-dusk nerves, the kind that come from being truly alone in a place where the shadows are long and the trees stretch tall and dense around you. I built a fire, settling in with a beer, and watched the sky darken. The stars flickered to life, one by one, like tiny beacons of safety. But the longer I sat there, the more I started to notice a sound, soft, rhythmic, like footsteps crunching through leaves just beyond the firelight. I froze, straining my ears. Probably just a deer, I muttered to myself. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled my campsite, slow, deliberate. I shone my flashlight into the trees. Nothing. I couldn't see past the thick brush. My heart was pounding, but I tried to calm down. There was no one out here but me. It had to be an animal, something curious. Yet, a nagging feeling tugged at my gut, telling me it was something else. Something that knew I was there. After a while, the sound faded, but the unease didn't. I should have left then, packed up and gone back to my truck, but I didn't. Instead, I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and lay there listening. The woods were silent, too silent. No wind, no insects, not even the distant howl of a coyote. Just the oppressive, suffocating quiet. And then came the whisper. It was so faint I wasn't sure I heard it at first, but there it was again, clearer this time. It sounded like my name, drifting on the air. My blood ran cold. I sat up, clutching the knife I kept by my side. "Matt," I called out, my voice barely a whisper. It had to be him. Maybe he'd decided to mess with me after all. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. Matt was hours away. The voice was wrong too. Distorted somehow, like it was trying to mimic a human sound but didn't quite know how. "Matt?" I repeated louder now. Silence. I lay back down, gripping the knife tighter, my pulse thudding in my ears. Minutes passed, maybe hours, I couldn't tell. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, something was tugging at my tent. I bolted upright, heart slamming into my chest. I could hear the nylon fabric stretching. Something scratching against it from the outside like claws or fingers. I held my breath, every muscle tensed. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, like whatever was out there wanted me to know it was close. I fumbled for my flashlight and shone it at the tent wall. Shadows danced, but nothing solid appeared. The scratching stopped. I sat there, knife in hand, for what felt like an eternity, waiting for it to start again. But it didn't. When dawn finally broke, I crawled out of the tent, exhausted, but relieved to see the light creeping through the trees. The forest seemed normal again, birds chirping, the creek bubbling. That's when I saw the footprints. They circled my campsite, the grass flattened in strange patterns, almost like hooves. But they were long, elongated, not like anything I'd seen before. They led off into the woods, disappearing into the thick brush. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe some animal had wandered through. But deep down, I knew better. I packed up quickly, eager to put distance between myself and whatever had stalked me last night. As I hiked back to my truck, the woods grew unnervingly quiet again. The further I walked, the heavier the silence became, pressing in on me like a physical weight. Halfway back, I saw him. A park ranger standing at the edge of the trail, staring at me. Relief flooded through me. I hadn't seen anyone in days. "Hey," I called, waving. But he didn't respond. Just stood there, still, watching. Something about him seemed off. His uniform was dirty, tattered at the edges, and his skin was too pale, like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. His eyes were black, not just dark, but black, hollow. My steps faltered. The relief I felt turned to dread. I forced myself to keep walking, refusing to meet his gaze. But as I passed him, he spoke. "Leaving so soon?" His voice, it was the same distorted whisper I'd heard the night before. I didn't respond. I just kept walking, faster now, not daring to look back. The woods seemed to close in around me, the air thick with something unseen, something watching. I reached my truck and threw my gear into the back, my hands shaking. As I sped down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The ranger was standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. And beside him, something else, a figure taller than any human, its skin stretched tight over bones, its eyes glowing faintly in the morning light. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. But I know I'll never truly escape whatever was in those woods. Because sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear that whisper. It's closer now. It's strange, really, how the woods seem to close in on you once the sun dips below the tree line. I'd been a park ranger for over a decade, and I'd seen plenty of strange things, heard my share of unsettling stories. But this was something else. I'd decided to camp out for a few nights, deep in the heart of the forest, far from the usual trails and picnic spots. No one knew these woods like I did, or so I thought. I brought the essentials: a tent, a flashlight, and my old hunting knife. I wanted a break from the radio chatter, the endless updates from the park's main station. Out here, I could get some peace, surrounded by towering pines and the whisper of the wind. It was on the second night that things started feeling off. The fire crackled low, casting long shadows that danced across the trees, and as I sat staring into the flames, I felt it. An odd sensation, like I was being watched. I shook it off, thinking maybe a deer had wandered close. But then I heard it, a low guttural sound from somewhere in the darkness. It wasn't the kind of noise a deer would make. This was deep, almost a growl, but with a rasping undertone that prickled my skin. I scanned the edge of the firelight with my flashlight, half expecting to see nothing. But my beam landed on something just for a split second, and it moved too quickly to catch, darting behind a tree. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen, thin, long limbs, pale as moonlight, with eyes that reflected back like shards of glass. I stood up, heart hammering, straining my ears for any sound, but the woods were dead silent now, unnaturally so. Even the usual nighttime symphony of crickets and owls had gone mute, as if they too were holding their breath. I cursed under my breath and tried to shake it off. It was probably just the shadows playing tricks, I told myself. I'd been out here long enough to know the mind could conjure strange things in the dark. I settled back down, poking at the fire to give it some life. I was trying to calm my nerves when I heard it again, that growling rasp, closer this time. Every instinct told me to get out of there, to leave the fire and head back to the ranger station. But I stayed. I don't know why, but something kept me rooted, like my own curiosity was shackling me to that spot. I stood up and scanned the woods again, but now the trees seemed to close in, forming a solid wall of darkness. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement again. Something crawling on all fours, slipping between the trees like it belonged there, yet everything about it felt wrong. Its limbs were too long, bending at unnatural angles, and its skin was too smooth, almost like polished bone. It didn't look like any creature I knew, and yet there was something familiar about it that made my blood run cold. I tried to focus on its shape, but every time I thought I had it pinned down, it shifted, like it was melting into the shadows only to reappear somewhere else. I could feel its eyes on me, unblinking, watching with a hunger that made my skin crawl. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding weak against the suffocating silence. The thing stopped, just at the edge of the firelight. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. For a moment, I thought maybe it was gone. But then I saw its eyes, gleaming like twin embers, fixed on me with an intensity that felt almost human. And then it spoke. Not in words exactly, but in a whisper that seemed to come from the trees themselves, filling the air with a hiss that twisted and curled around me. It felt like a warning, like it was trying to tell me something I couldn't understand. And that's when I felt it, a sudden searing pain in my chest, like ice-cold claws digging into my heart. I stumbled back, gasping, clutching at my chest, but there was nothing there. The thing was gone, the shadows empty once more. But the pain lingered, a cold ache that settled deep into my bones, and I knew then that whatever that thing was, it had marked me. The rest of the night passed in a blur of shadows and whispers. I barely slept, and when dawn finally broke, I packed up and headed back to the station, desperate to leave that cursed spot behind. I thought I was safe once I reached the station, but the forest followed me back. I started hearing things, seeing things. Shadows that slithered along the walls, whispers that echoed in the empty hallways. I tried to tell myself it was just exhaustion, that I'd been out there too long. But then I started noticing things that didn't add up. Missing time, strange marks on my skin, like claw marks that appeared overnight. And the dreams. Every night I'd dream of the woods, of those eyes staring back at me from the darkness, waiting, watching. And each time I woke up, I could swear I felt that same cold ache in my chest, like something was still there, inside me. It's been a few weeks now, and I can feel myself slipping. The other rangers are starting to notice, asking if I'm all right, if I need a break, but I know they can't help me. I know that whatever was out there, whatever marked me, it's still with me, lurking just beneath the surface. Sometimes when I catch my reflection, I see a flash of something else, something pale and hollow-eyed, staring back. And I wonder if I ever really left those woods, or if some part of me is still out there, wandering in the shadows, forever lost. So if you ever find yourself deep in the woods and you hear something strange, a whisper, a growl that scrapes against your bones, don't stay, don't wait. Because there are things out there, things that watch and wait, and sometimes they take more than you're willing to give, and sometimes they don't let you go at all. They called it Dead Man's Hollow. The name alone should have been enough to keep me away, but curiosity got the better of me. As a park ranger, I'd always heard the legends, the whispered tales of people vanishing, of strange lights flickering in the darkness, and of the voices. Most people shrugged them off as campfire stories, but every once in a while someone would return from the hollow with eyes haunted and speech shaken, never quite the same. When I got assigned to investigate reports of strange occurrences there, I tried to laugh it off. But as I headed out that evening, I couldn't shake a gnawing sense of dread. The sun was sinking fast, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges, casting long shadows across the forest floor. It felt like the trees themselves were drawing closer, eager to swallow the light before it disappeared. I followed the narrow, winding path that led into the hollow, where the trees grew thicker and the air grew heavier. As I walked, I started to hear faint sounds, a rustling, a whispering, just at the edge of my hearing. I told myself it was just the wind, but the further I went, the more distinct the whispers became. They were voices, overlapping and murmuring, too many to count. The trail soon opened up into a small clearing, overgrown with thorny brambles and twisted vines. In the center of the clearing stood an old abandoned cabin. I'd seen it on maps, but they always said it was just a ruin, long since collapsed. Now, though, it stood tall, its windows dark and empty, a haunting presence amid the trees. As I stepped closer, the whispers grew louder, almost urgent. They seemed to be calling my name, each syllable drawn out, mocking, as if they knew me. I shivered, gripping my flashlight tightly, and took another step forward. The air was thick with the scent of decay, a sickly sweet odor that clung to my lungs. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon me. I decided to investigate the cabin, hoping to find some explanation for what I was hearing. As I approached the door, it swung open with a groan, revealing a darkness so deep it seemed to swallow my flashlight's beam. I hesitated, but curiosity drove me onward. The inside was musty, filled with shadows that twisted and stretched along the walls. Old furniture lay scattered about, half-rotted and covered in dust. And then I saw it, a journal, lying open on a table in the center of the room. I picked it up, and as I flipped through the brittle pages, a chill ran down my spine. The writing was frantic, scrawled in large looping letters that spoke of encounters with creatures that wore the faces of loved ones and sounds that led travelers astray. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the cabin with a cacophony of voices. I dropped the journal, and it fell open to a page that was smeared with dark stains. Words scrawled hastily across the page. Do not trust their faces. They wear our skins. They know our secrets. Before I could react, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, flashlight at the ready, and saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with eyes that were too wide, too empty. He looked familiar, though I couldn't place him. And then he spoke, in a voice that was almost mine, yet not quite right. "Why are you here?" he asked, his tone slow and distorted, like he was trying out each word for the first time. I couldn't answer, my throat tight with fear. He stepped closer, and I noticed that his skin seemed off, like it didn't quite fit. As he moved, I caught a glimpse of something underneath, something dark and shifting, as if his flesh was just a mask hiding something far more sinister. He reached out a hand, and I saw his fingers were too long, the nails blackened and jagged. I backed away, bumping into the table, and he stopped, tilting his head like a curious animal. And then, as if on cue, more figures appeared in the doorway, each one wearing a face I recognized. There was my old mentor, who had disappeared years ago, and a camper who'd gone missing last summer. They all stared at me, their faces stretched into unnatural smiles. I stumbled backward, desperate to escape, but the cabin felt alive, the walls closing in. The whispers became a roar, drowning out my thoughts, filling my mind with fragments of memory that weren't mine. I could feel them clawing at my sanity, pulling me toward them, toward their hollow, hungry eyes. In a panic, I turned and ran, barreling out of the cabin and into the woods, but the voices followed, echoing around me, filling the air with laughter that sounded too much like my own. The path twisted and turned, and I found myself deeper in the woods, lost among trees that seemed to shift and writhe as I ran. Every shadow felt like a creature, every sound a step closer to whatever waited for me in the darkness. Just when I thought I couldn't run any longer, I burst into another clearing. But this time, there was no escape. The figures stood all around me, their eyes gleaming, their faces stretched and wrong. And among them I saw myself, my own face, hollow and empty, staring back with a smile that wasn't mine. They spoke in unison, their voices a chilling chorus. "You cannot leave. You are one of us now." I screamed, and the world faded to black. When I woke, I was back at the station with no memory of how I returned. They say I must have hit my head, that I must have been hallucinating. But every time I close my eyes, I see their faces, feel their eyes upon me. I know they're still out there waiting for me in Deadman's Hollow, where the voices never die. And sometimes late at night I hear them calling, pulling me back, their whispers wrapping around my mind like vines, dragging me closer to the shadows that never let go. The forest doesn't forget, it waits. And one day, I know I'll answer its call. I've spent years working as a park ranger, stationed in one of the most remote forests in the country. People love to think the woods are peaceful, a place to escape, and for a while I thought the same. That was until last summer, when I learned how wrong I was. It was early July, and the nights had grown long and sticky, with the humidity clinging to your skin like a film. I'd taken to patrolling the deeper trails by myself. The usual routine: make sure campers weren't doing anything stupid, listen to the chorus of the woods, check for wildlife. But out here, miles from any major trail, things felt different. The woods felt wrong, like they were watching me more than I was watching them. It started with the sounds. They were subtle at first, branches snapping in the distance, far beyond where any animal should be moving. I wrote it off as deer or coyotes. But there was something strange about it. The snapping didn't follow the erratic, scattered rhythm of animals. It was slow, deliberate, like something stepping carefully just out of sight. Then came the whispers. I first heard them 2 weeks in. It was just after midnight. The moon was barely a sliver in the sky, and the only sound should have been the wind in the trees. But I heard them, faint, like they were carried on a breeze that didn't exist. Voices muttering in a language I couldn't understand, yet somehow felt like I should know. I stopped dead in my tracks, shining my flashlight through the dense undergrowth. Nothing. Only the tall, swaying trees and the impenetrable darkness beyond them. I didn't mention it to anyone. I'd been out here long enough to know how isolation messes with your head, and I figured the loneliness was getting to me. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the worse it got. I started seeing things, at first just flashes, a shadow darting between trees, the silhouette of something humanoid in the distance, gone when I blinked. But one night, just before dawn, I saw it clearly. I was by the riverbank, a place I often went to clear my head, trying to shake the creeping paranoia that had been building inside me. I was sitting on a rock, listening to the water rush over the stones, when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Standing on the other side of the river was something tall and thin, almost human, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its torso too narrow, and it moved in a way that made my stomach turn. Jerky, like it was learning how to use its body. I stared, frozen, and as I did, it tilted its head toward me, its face hidden in shadow, but I could feel its gaze. I should have run, but I couldn't. My body was locked in place, my breath stuck in my throat. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. No sound, no movement, just the empty woods. After that night, I stopped going out alone. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared. I felt like something was watching me all the time. The whispers grew louder, closer, and I started hearing footsteps behind me on the trails. Heavy, deliberate steps that would stop whenever I turned around. My breaking point came on a stormy night, the wind howling through the trees and rain slashing sideways. I was in the station, alone again, when the power went out. The radios crackled with static, and for a while it was just the sound of the storm. Then the whispers came back, but this time they were right outside the door. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through the window. There was nothing but the dark shapes of trees thrashing in the wind. But I knew it was out there. I could feel it. I heard footsteps, slow, dragging steps, circling the cabin. My skin crawled as I realized whatever was out there wasn't trying to hide anymore. It wanted me to know it was there. Suddenly the door rattled like something heavy had slammed against it. I jumped back, barely able to keep the beam of my flashlight steady. My breath came in ragged gasps as the door creaked, the wood groaning under the pressure. I backed into the corner of the room, heart hammering in my chest, waiting for the inevitable, waiting for it to break through. Then silence. I didn't dare move for what felt like hours, the rain still pounding on the roof. Slowly, I inched toward the door, listening, straining for any sound outside. Nothing. I opened the door a crack and peered out into the night. And there it was. not 5 feet away, crouched low, staring at me with eyes that gleamed in the dim light of my flashlight. Its body was twisted and wrong, limbs contorted at impossible angles. The face, God, the face. It looked like a man's face stretched over a skull too large for it, the mouth too wide, filled with teeth that were too sharp, too long. It grinned at me, as if amused by my terror. I slammed the door shut and bolted it. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely lock it. The thing outside let out a low guttural sound, something like a laugh, and I knew this was no animal, no cryptid. It was something far worse. The whispers began again, this time inside my head. Clearer now. I understood them. They weren't words, but a feeling, a knowledge. The thing wasn't alone. There were more of them. And they weren't creatures of flesh and blood. They were us. I don't know how long I sat there, huddled in the dark, but by morning, the thing was gone. The forest was quiet again, but it wasn't the same. I wasn't the same. I left the woods the next day and never went back. I've tried to forget, but the truth haunts me. Whatever it was, it wore the faces of the dead. It wasn't a cryptid or some unknown creature. It was something ancient, something that had been in those woods long before any of us. And it was wearing my face when it smiled. I've always loved the solitude of the woods. It's where I feel most at home, away from the noise and chaos of civilization. As a park ranger, I spend most of my days patrolling trails, checking campsites, and occasionally rescuing lost hikers. But it was my days off that I cherished the most, when I could venture deep into the forest, far beyond where any hiker would dare to go. This time, I decided to camp out near a secluded lake I'd found on a map, miles from the nearest trail. I planned to spend a quiet night under the stars, just me and the wild. The sun was sinking below the tree line as I set up my tent, casting the woods in a dusky glow. The air was cool and smelled of pine, and the only sound was the gentle rustling of leaves. I built a small fire and settled in, feeling the weight of the week slip away. My flashlight lay beside me, just in case, though I doubted I'd need it. I knew these woods like the back of my hand, but as the darkness crept in, an unsettling feeling started to gnaw at me. It was as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, watching, waiting. Around midnight I heard it, the first sound that made my skin crawl. It was faint, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. A low, guttural growl echoed from the shadows beyond the firelight. I froze, straining my ears, trying to make sense of it. My mind raced through the possibilities. A coyote, maybe a wolf. But this sounded different, deeper. It didn't belong. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, sweeping it back and forth, but saw nothing. The fire crackled, throwing twisted shadows against the trees, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I'd heard stories before, tales around the campfire about creatures that lived in these woods. The old ones called them skinwalkers, beings that could take the shape of animals or even other people. I'd never given much thought to them, until now. The growl came again, closer this time. My flashlight flickered and I cursed under my breath, giving it a shake. When it came back on, I could have sworn I saw something, a figure, hunched and twisted, slipping behind a tree. It moved unnaturally, as if it was struggling to walk upright. I stood up, heart pounding, and called out, hoping to scare it off. But my voice sounded small, swallowed by the thick, suffocating darkness. And then I heard it, a voice. It was Miney, calling back to me from the woods. "Help! Help me!" It cried, mimicking my tone exactly. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized it was coming from the direction I had seen that figure. I knew deep down that it wasn't human. I had heard tales of the skinwalker's mimicry, its ability to replicate voices to lure its victims. I had always dismissed it as superstition, but standing there, surrounded by darkness, I wasn't so sure anymore. The voice kept calling, growing louder, more insistent. "Help! Over here!" it wailed, each word dripping with a twisted mockery. I knew I should run, that I should get out of there as fast as possible. But something held me in place. A morbid curiosity, a need to know what lay beyond the darkness. Slowly I stepped away from the fire, flashlight shaking in my hand. The voice continued, repeating my own desperate cries, each one more distorted than the last. I moved forward, feeling the cold air wrap around me like a shroud, suffocating, stifling. I reached the spot where I had seen the figure, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. And then from behind me I heard footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, echoing through the silence. I spun around and there it was, standing just outside the glow of the firelight. It looked like a man, but its limbs were too long, its posture too hunched. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, reflecting the flickering flames. It wore my face. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. I tried to speak, to demand answers, but the words caught in my throat. The creature grinned, a twisted smile that stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. It opened its mouth and in my own voice it whispered, "I've been waiting for you." Panic surged through me and I turned to run, crashing through the underbrush, branches clawing at my face and arms. Behind me I could hear it following, its footsteps matching mine, mirroring my every move. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the lake, breath ragged, heart hammering in my chest. I looked around, desperate, but there was nowhere to hide, nowhere to escape. The creature stood across the water, staring at me with those glowing eyes, its face still a grotesque mask of my own. And then it stepped forward, its body rippling, shifting. As it moved, it shed my likeness, transforming into a creature of shadows and twisted limbs. I watched in horror as it sank to all fours, its bones cracking and snapping, morphing into the shape of a massive wolf, its fur matted and dark. It let out a howl that shattered the silence, a sound that seemed to pierce my very soul. I knew in that moment that there was no escaping it. I had ventured too deep, strayed too far into its domain. The legends were true, and I was nothing more than another victim, another story to be told around the campfire. As the creature moved toward me, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. Maybe this was how it was meant to end, alone in the woods, swallowed by the darkness. The last thing I saw was its yellow eyes staring into mine before everything went black. Now I'm not sure where I am. I wander these woods, a ghostly echo of the man I used to be, trapped between the trees, forever bound to this place. Sometimes I hear the hikers passing by and I call out to them, hoping they'll come closer, hoping they'll see me. But they never do. And maybe that's for the best. I've been a park ranger for almost 7 years now. The vast, untamed wilderness has always been my second home. But there's one patch of forest that I dread. A place where the trees seem to breathe, where the night feels heavier, as if something ancient stirs in the darkness. It's called Black Pine Woods, a stretch of forest so thick that sunlight barely filters through the canopy during the day, and at night, it becomes a different world entirely. It was late October when I was assigned to patrol Black Pine. The other rangers joked about the place, calling it the Silent Zone, because the wildlife rarely made a sound there. I dismissed their banter at first. The forest is the forest. It's wild, unpredictable. That's what I told myself anyway. I arrived at the ranger station near dusk, the sky turning blood red as the sun slipped behind the trees. The air was still, unnaturally so, with no wind to rustle the leaves. I grabbed my gear, checked the radio, nothing but static, and set out to cover the northern trail. The walk was uneventful at first, but as night fell, the woods transformed. The usual sounds of the forest, the distant hoots of owls, the rustling of small animals, were absent. It was dead quiet, save for my own footsteps crunching against the underbrush. I kept my flashlight close, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. That's when I saw it, a figure standing between two trees about 30 yards ahead. I froze, thinking maybe it was a lost hiker. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. No answer. The figure didn't move, just stood there, hunched over, arms dangling unnaturally low. My pulse quickened. I shone the light directly on it. The figure vanished, gone without a sound, as if it had never been there. I blinked, my heart hammering in my chest. Maybe it was a trick of the light, I thought. Shadows can play tricks on the mind out here. I kept walking, though a gnawing unease settled into my bones. A few minutes later I heard it, a low, guttural growl. It wasn't like any animal I'd heard before, more primal, almost human. I swept the flashlight in the direction of the sound. The light caught something. 2 glowing eyes, reflecting the beam back at me from the darkness. They were too high up to belong to any animal I knew of. I backed up slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The eyes disappeared, but I could hear movement, something large circling me in the trees, staying just out of sight. I didn't run. Running would make me prey. Instead, I kept moving, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, never left. I reached a clearing and took a breath, relieved to be out of the thick brush. But the feeling of safety was short-lived. On the other side of the clearing, there was something wrong. A dead deer lay on the ground, its body twisted in ways that defied logic. Its head was turned completely around, and its legs bent backward. Worse, strange symbols were carved into the animal's flesh. Symbols I didn't recognize, but they filled me with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. That's when I heard the whisper, a voice, faint, carried on the still air, though I couldn't make out the words. It was coming from the trees, but the source was nowhere in sight. Then, the whispering stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and too heavy to be human. I spun around, expecting to see the source of the sound, but there was nothing. My heart pounded in my ears, and every instinct screamed at me to leave. I radioed the station, but it was still nothing but static. As I turned to head back, the footsteps started again, closer this time, right behind me. I swung the flashlight around, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a creature, taller than any man, its body covered in dark, matted fur. But it wasn't a bear. Its face, I can barely describe it. It looked like a wolf, but twisted, its eyes too large, too human, and its mouth. It smiled, lips pulling back to reveal rows of jagged yellow teeth. But that wasn't the worst part. It stood on 2 legs. Before I could react, it took a step forward, its bones creaking with the motion, as if they didn't quite fit under its skin. My body locked up in terror, and I stumbled backward, falling hard onto the forest floor. It moved closer, its breath hot and rancid on the air. And for a moment, I thought, this was it. That this thing would tear me apart, right here in the middle of Black Pine Woods. But it stopped. It cocked its head to the side as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Then it turned and walked back into the darkness without a sound. I lay there, shaking, trying to comprehend what I'd just seen. That's when the whispering returned, louder this time, almost frantic. I forced myself up and bolted back toward the station, running blindly through the trees. The whispering followed me, growing louder, more insistent, until it felt like the voices were inside my head, pushing against my skull. When I finally reached the station, I collapsed inside, slamming the door behind me. I locked it, breathing hard, trying to calm down. But then, I heard something behind me, a low creak of wood, like something shifting. I turned slowly, and my heart nearly stopped. There, standing just inside the window, was my own reflection, but it wasn't me. It had the same face, the same uniform, but its eyes were wrong. They were too large, too human, and it was smiling. That's when I realized I never made it out of those woods. I'm still there somewhere, lost in the darkness, and whatever's in here with me, it's wearing my face. It was supposed to be an easy weekend. Just me, my brother Daniel, and our friend Kyle, camping out in the dense backwoods of Cedar Hollow. The 3 of us had grown up hiking together, exploring the outdoors, so we figured we'd get one more trip in before the summer ended. Cedar Hollow was perfect, remote, thick with trees, and far from any city noise. We'd found an old, forgotten trail on an old map and thought it would be fun to follow it as deep as we could go. No phones, no GPS, just the three of us, a compass, and enough supplies to last the weekend. We wanted to challenge ourselves, push a little deeper into nature than we ever had before. We should have turned back when we saw the ranger. We had parked at the ranger station to check in, and the guy behind the desk looked at us like we'd just stepped out of a grave. His uniform was worn, his eyes heavy with something I couldn't quite place. Was it fear? Exhaustion? Cedar Hollow? He asked, frowning as he looked at our gear. That's a rough area. Not many folks head out that far anymore. You sure about that? Yeah, Daniel said with his usual confidence, slinging his pack over his shoulder. We've camped all over these woods. We can handle it. The ranger stared at us for a long moment before nodding slowly. If you say so, just don't go too deep. People go missing up there. Strange things happen. You hear anything at night that doesn't feel right. Just stay in your tent. Don't go looking. Kyle laughed, thinking the guy was just trying to spook us, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. Still, we were excited, so we shrugged it off and headed out. The first day was perfect. We hiked deeper and deeper into the woods, far beyond the well-traveled paths, the canopy growing thicker above us. By late afternoon, we'd found a small clearing next to a creek and set up camp. The air was fresh, the trees towering over us like ancient guardians. It felt like we were the only people for miles. But as night fell, something shifted. It was subtle at first. The usual sounds of the forest began to fade, leaving an eerie stillness. No birds, no rustling leaves, no wind. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes you feel like something is watching, listening. We sat around the fire trying to brush it off, telling stories, laughing. But we were all on edge. Even Kyle, who usually wasn't afraid of anything, kept glancing over his shoulder into the darkness. Every now and then we'd hear a faint noise like footsteps, but too slow, too deliberate. Around midnight, as the fire burned low, Daniel stood up, his face pale. "Do you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. We all stopped talking and listened. At first there was nothing, just the crackle of the fire. But then, faint and distant, we heard it. A voice. It was soft, almost like someone was speaking from far away, just on the edge of hearing. It didn't sound right, though. Too hollow, too broken. Like someone was trying to mimic a human voice but didn't quite know how. "Who the hell is out here?" Kyle muttered, standing up and grabbing his flashlight. We all listened again, but the voice had stopped, just silence. "I'm gonna check it out," Kyle said, already heading toward the trees. "Probably just some other hikers messing with us." I grabbed his arm. "Kyle, wait. What if it's not hikers? It could be an animal or something else." He shook me off. "Come on, man, don't tell me you're scared. It's probably nothing." Against my better judgment, Daniel and I followed him. We grabbed our flashlights and knives, making our way toward the tree line. The beams of our lights cut through the darkness, but all we could see were shadows and the faint glow of the fire behind us. And then we heard it again, closer this time. A voice, clearer now but still wrong, like it was calling out, but the words were garbled, almost inhuman. The sound chilled me to the bone. Kyle stopped in his tracks. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. We stood there for a long moment, listening. The voice was all around us now, like it was circling, but we couldn't see anything. Just the dark woods pressing in on us. "Kyle," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "we need to go back. Now." But before he could respond, there was a loud snap, like a tree branch breaking, followed by the sound of something moving through the brush. Fast. Too fast. It was coming toward us. We bolted. I don't think I've ever run that fast in my life. We tore through the trees, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we sprinted back toward camp. My heart was pounding in my chest, adrenaline surging through my veins. I could hear something behind us, something big, crashing through the underbrush, following us. When we finally burst into the clearing, the fire had almost died. We grabbed what we could, our bags, our tent still half collapsed, and we ran. We didn't stop until we reached the trail, and even then we kept moving, practically running all the way back to the car. When we reached the parking lot, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the ranger station. The ranger was standing outside, waiting. He didn't say anything when he saw us, just nodded slowly like he knew. We threw our gear into the car and sped off, none of us speaking, all of us shaken to the core. I haven't spoken much to Daniel or Kyle about that night. None of us want to acknowledge what we heard, what we felt. But I know one thing for sure. We weren't alone out there. And whatever was in those woods, and it wasn't human, I still hear it sometimes, though, late at night when everything is quiet. That voice, whispering just on the edge of hearing. I'll never go back to Cedar Hollow, and if you're smart, you won't either. I'd been itching for a break from the city, so when my buddy Mark suggested a weekend camping trip in the remote woods near Pikes Hollow, I didn't hesitate. He had mentioned the area was supposedly haunted, but I laughed it off, thinking he was just trying to scare me. I mean, who really believes in that stuff, right? Mark swore up and down that the place had seen more than its fair share of disappearances over the years, but I figured that just meant fewer tourists and more room for us. By the time we arrived at the trailhead, the sun was starting to dip behind the treetops, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, and a faint chill clung to the breeze. As we hiked deeper into the woods, the sounds of civilization faded, until all we could hear were our footsteps crunching on fallen leaves and the occasional bird call echoing through the trees. After setting up camp near a small clearing, Mark and I settled in around the fire, the flames crackling and sending sparks up into the twilight. It felt good to be out here, away from the city lights, just the two of us and the endless stretch of forest around us. We spent hours talking, laughing, and cooking over the fire. But as the night grew darker, an uneasy silence settled over the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. "Did you hear that?" Mark asked, breaking the silence. His voice was low, almost a whisper. I strained my ears but heard nothing unusual, just the wind rustling through the trees. "You're just trying to freak me out," I replied, forcing a laugh, but my voice sounded hollow even to me. Mark didn't answer. He just stared out into the darkness, his eyes narrowed, scanning the trees. And then I heard it, a low guttural growl, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere just beyond the firelight. Every muscle in my body tensed, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The growl was followed by a rustling sound, like something heavy moving through the underbrush. "Maybe it's just an animal," I said, trying to convince myself as much as Mark. "Yeah, maybe," he replied, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. We both knew there were no bears in this area, at least not according to the park ranger we'd talked to earlier. He'd warned us about coyotes, sure, but this didn't sound like a coyote. It sounded wrong. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, stepping into the circle of firelight. It was a park ranger, or at least he looked like one. His uniform was dirty and torn, and his face was pale, almost ghostly. "Evening, folks," he said, his voice flat and hollow. "You shouldn't be out here." Sorry, we didn't think we'd run into anyone out here," I stammered. "We, spoke to another ranger earlier, and he didn't mention any restrictions." The ranger's eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a strange sense of unease, like I was being pulled into some kind of trap. His eyes were too dark, almost black, and they didn't seem to reflect the firelight. "It's not safe," he replied, a hint of something menacing in his tone. "There are things in these woods that you don't want to meet." Before we could respond, he turned and walked back into the darkness, his figure blending seamlessly with the shadows. Mark and I sat there, stunned and silent, watching until we could no longer see him. "We should leave," I said finally, breaking the silence. "Something's not right about that guy." Mark nodded, but as we started to pack up our gear, we heard another growl, this time closer, almost right behind us. We whipped around, our flashlight slicing through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the trees stretching endlessly in every direction. "Let's go," Mark said, his voice shaking. We grabbed our backpacks and started back toward the trail, our footsteps quick and desperate. Every few steps I glanced over my shoulder, convinced I'd see something lurking in the shadows. As we reached the edge of the clearing, a loud snap echoed through the woods, and we froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I didn't know what was out there, but I could feel it watching us, waiting. Suddenly, Mark grabbed my arm, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my mouth dry. "Let's just keep moving." We picked up the pace, practically running through the trees, when I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a voice, Mark's voice, coming from somewhere off the trail. "Help, over here." I stopped dead in my tracks, staring at Mark beside me, who looked just as shocked. That sounded like you," I whispered, my heart pounding. "It's not me," Mark replied, his voice barely audible. "We need to get out of here." We broke into a full sprint, adrenaline fueling our escape, but the forest seemed to stretch on forever. Every few moments I heard Mark's voice calling out from the darkness, the same words over and over. "Help! Over here!" We finally burst out of the woods, gasping for air, and stumbled back to the trailhead where we'd parked. As we fumbled with the car keys, I glanced back at the trees, half expecting to see something standing there, watching us. But there was nothing, just the empty woods, silent and still. We sped back to the nearest ranger station and reported what had happened. The ranger on duty listened quietly, his expression grim. When we finished, he took a deep breath and said, "You two are lucky. A few years back, another pair of campers disappeared in those woods. We found their camp, but we never found them. Locals say it was a skinwalker." Mark and I exchanged a glance, a shiver running down my spine. We didn't stay to ask questions. We got back in the car and drove away, leaving Pikes Hollow far behind. To this day, I can still hear that voice sometimes late at night, calling from the shadows. And I know deep down that whatever was in those woods is still out there waiting. Camping alone has never bothered me. In fact, I always found it peaceful. No distractions, no people, just the sound of the wind moving through the trees and the crackle of a fire. But after what happened last spring, I haven't camped since. I'm not sure I ever will again. It was a last-minute trip. I had some vacation days to use and the weather was perfect. Clear skies and warm enough that I didn't have to worry about freezing at night. I packed light, grabbed my tent, and drove out to the cold, hollow wilderness. It's one of those places where you could hike for days and never see another soul. Perfect for someone looking for solitude. After a few hours of hiking, I found a nice spot by a small pond. The water was still, reflecting the trees and sky like a mirror. I set up camp, started a fire, and settled in for the evening. As the sun set, casting a deep orange glow across the pond, I felt that familiar sense of calm wash over me. I wasn't worried about anything. I was alone, miles away from anyone, and that was exactly what I wanted. As the night fell, I sat by the fire, sipping from my thermos and staring into the flames. The forest was quiet, aside from the usual rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. It started subtly, so subtle that at first I didn't even notice. It was the absence of sound. The wind that had been softly moving through the trees earlier had stopped. The frogs and crickets that had been filling the night with their songs had gone silent. The forest was still, unnaturally still. I looked around, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Something was wrong. I could feel it. There's a certain kind of quiet that you don't get used to, even after years of camping alone. A quiet that feels wrong. I tried to brush it off, poking at the fire to keep myself busy, but that feeling of being watched crept in, gnawing at me. I shone my flashlight into the trees, the beam cutting through the darkness. But there was nothing, just the thick trunks of the trees and the dense underbrush beyond. Then I heard it, a low, steady tapping. It was coming from somewhere in the woods, a rhythmic sound, like someone gently knocking on wood. At first, I thought it was a woodpecker, but it was too slow for that, too deliberate. I stood up, shining my flashlight toward the direction of the sound, but as soon as the light hit the trees, the tapping stopped. I turned back to the fire, trying to shake off the unease. Maybe it was just an animal, I thought, something moving around in the underbrush, but the forest was still dead silent. That kind of silence that presses down on you, makes you feel like something is holding its breath. Then the tapping started again, this time closer, much closer. I turned the flashlight back toward the trees, the beam trembling in my hand, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the reach of the light. It was tall, too tall to be a person, and unnaturally thin. Its limbs seemed too long for its body, its arms hanging low by its sides, motionless. It stood perfectly still, its head slightly tilted, like it was watching me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was too dark to make out any details, but there was something wrong with the shape, something off. The way it stood, the way it didn't move, made my skin crawl. I kept the flashlight trained on it, and slowly, very slowly, I backed toward the fire. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every instinct in me screamed to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. As I reached the fire, I grabbed a log and threw it into the flames, sending a burst of sparks into the air. The light flared up, casting long shadows through the clearing. For a moment, I looked away from the figure, just for a second. When I turned back, it was gone. The woods were silent again, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left. If anything, it had grown stronger. I stood there, flashlight in one hand, the other gripping a stick from the fire, my eyes darting between the trees. I didn't see it again that night. I sat by the fire until dawn, my body rigid with fear, listening to every little sound, expecting that thing to reappear at any moment. But it never did. When the sun finally rose, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and left. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I reached my car. The whole way, I felt like something was following me, just out of sight, lurking in the shadows of the trees. I don't know what I saw that night. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or my imagination playing tricks on me after too much time alone in the woods. But deep down, I know it wasn't. Something was out there watching me, and sometimes late at night when I'm alone in my apartment, I still hear that tapping. Soft, steady, like a knock on wood. It's been months since that trip, and I haven't gone camping since. I'm not sure I ever will again. Because whatever that thing was, I don't think it wanted me to leave. And I'm terrified that one day I'll hear that tapping again, this time much closer. I always considered myself an outdoor enthusiast. There was something about the serenity of nature, the isolation of a remote campsite, that brought me peace. This trip was meant to be no different. Just me, a backpack, and miles of untouched wilderness. No phone, no social media, just quiet. The forest I chose this time was one I'd never been to before. Far off the beaten path, about a 5-hour drive from the nearest town. It was one of those places you hear about on hiking blogs, where people brag about the remoteness, the complete disconnect from the modern world. That's what I wanted. So, I found a clearing deep within the woods, set up my tent, and made a small fire before the sun dipped below the treetops. The first few hours were peaceful, the rustling leaves in the breeze, the crackle of the fire. But as night fell, things started to feel off. I don't know how else to describe it. The air grew colder, and the forest around me felt like it was watching, waiting. The first strange sound I heard was just after dusk, a soft, low whisper, so faint I thought I imagined it. It seemed to drift from the tree line, carried by the wind. I brushed it off. Maybe it was just the trees, but then it happened again, clearer this time. A voice. Faint, but unmistakable. I stood up, scanning the woods. There was nothing, just shadows. The fire flickered, casting long, twisting shapes across the clearing, making it harder to see. I called out, a mistake in retrospect, but no one answered. My skin prickled. I felt the weight of being truly alone out here. For a moment I thought about packing up and leaving, but no. It was probably just my imagination, right? The mind plays tricks when it's quiet. Hours passed and the whispering stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes I could swear I heard footsteps. Soft, barely there, but unmistakable. They seemed to circle the tent, moving slowly, deliberately. I unzipped the tent, flashlight in hand, and stepped outside. The air was still, too still. Even the insects had gone quiet. I swept the beam of the flashlight through the trees, but again saw nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, just silence. Then, just as I was about to head back inside, I saw something. A figure. Far off in the trees, barely visible between the trunks. It was standing perfectly still, just outside the range of my light. I could only make out its shape, tall, thin, human-like, but something was wrong. Its proportions seemed off. The limbs too long, the head tilted at an unnatural angle. I called out again, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, motionless. I backed away, my heart racing, and ducked into the tent, zipping it up quickly. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I tried to convince myself that what I'd seen wasn't real. But it was. I don't know how long I sat there listening. The footsteps returned, closer this time, circling. Then, something touched the tent, a light brush, like fingers running along the fabric. My heart pounded in my chest, my throat tight with fear. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The sound of my own breathing was deafening. And then, the whispering came again, louder this time, just outside the tent. Come, out. I froze, every muscle in my body locked in terror. I could hear the voice more clearly now. It was unmistakable, like someone standing inches away from me, speaking directly into my ear. But I was alone. I knew I was alone. I must have passed out at some point because the next thing I remember, it was morning. The sun had risen and everything seemed normal again. No signs of anyone or anything around the tent. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't safe even in daylight. I hurriedly packed up my things, eager to leave this place behind. As I started the long hike back to my car, I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced that something was following me. The forest felt different now, darker, even in broad daylight. I could still hear the faintest hint of whispering, carried on the wind just out of earshot. By the time I reached my car, I was drenched in sweat, though the air was cool. I threw my gear into the back seat and slammed the door, relief washing over me as I turned the key in the ignition. That's when I noticed it. In the rearview mirror, standing at the edge of the forest, was the figure. That same unnatural shape, too tall, too still. Watching. I gunned the engine and sped down the dirt road, my eyes darting between the road and the mirror. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it somehow. Still watching. Still whispering. When I got home, I tried to forget about it. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light, the isolation playing with my mind. But then, last night, I woke up to the sound of whispering again. I was in my own bed, hundreds of miles away from that forest. But the whispering was the same, and this time it came from inside my room.